Hi there. This video is going to talk a little bit about how treaties worked in the ancient world and how that shows up in the book of Exodus. So here we go. In Genesis, we get the story of God making a covenant with Abraham. And in the book of Exodus, this same covenant between God and the chosen people is going to be sealed, going to kind of be made firm. And the agreement that God and the people make really parallels treaties that were made between nations at the time. Parity treaties were agreements between equals. So if you think of the word parity, meaning kind of evenness, just like if you were going to go golfing or miniature golfing, par is kind of average, even. A covenant treaty involved an agreement, involved witnesses, and involved some sort of ritual act. So if you remember the story in Genesis about God and Abraham making their agreement, God and Abraham make this agreement, and then there's that ritual act, the sacrifice of the animal and passing between the halves of the animal. That's a ritual act. And then you could also see vassal treaties. So those were agreements between a more powerful king and a weaker king. So when one country would conquer another country and make a treaty, that would often show up as a vassal treaty. Now, the agreement that God and the Israelites make in the book of Exodus has elements of a covenant treaty. So there are witnesses and the agreement itself. There's some ritual to it. And it also has elements of a vassal treaty. Now, this is how a vassal treaty would look. A vassal treaty typically includes 4 different elements. First, it describes the greatness and goodness of the king. So the treaty will talk about how wonderful and awesome and amazing the conquering king is. The treaty will list rules and regulations to be followed. So it will spell out, all right, here's what the conquered country is going to do. And it could also say, here's what the more powerful country is going to do. You know, we're going to respect the rights of these people, or take them into slavery, or sell off all their property. But it'll list rules and regulations that both parties are going to follow. Third, a vassal treaty will name witnesses and enforcers of that treaty. So who's witnessing those 2 kings making this treaty, and who will be the people that make sure this treaty gets carried out fairly. And then fourth, a vassal treaty describes the good things that will happen if the agreement is kept, and the bad things that will happen if the agreement is not kept. And this covenant agreement that we see in Exodus has these 4 elements of vassal treaty. So now it's going to be your turn. There are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments that show up in the Pentateuch. So the 10 Commandments are so important, we get to read them twice in the first 5 books of the Bible. For this particular activity, you're going to use the version of the 10 Commandments that appears in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And so when you go to that chapter, read that chapter, and can you find the 4 elements of a vassal treaty in that chapter? So you're going to cite the verses and explain how those particular verses show that element. So, for instance, the first step of a vassal treaty is to describe the greatness and goodness of the king. You can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 5 and, for example, say, oh, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 33 and 34 talks about how awesome the more powerful king is. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 62 through 65 list a bunch of rules and regulations for people to follow. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 1 talks about the witnesses to the treaty, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 10 talks about the different blessings that are going to come to the people. Now, just as a hint for you, none of those verses were actually correct. I made all of those up. You'll have to look in Deuteronomy chapter 5 on your own. Submit your work on Moodle.